evening. My name is Kristin West, and I would like to welcome you to spend the next hour with me learning about a relatively unknown composer named Génari Karganov. My aim for this lecture tonight is to introduce our featured composer, discuss his works, the time period he lived in, his inspirations, composing style, as well as the value his piano works have for performers, educators, and students. His piano works are what I will focus on because of their special significance for teaching and piano pedagogy. As a piano teacher, I am always looking for new material for my students, and his piano albums are a great source of fresh and exciting pieces. But before we dive into this exciting topic, I would like to play a short piece of his to help us set the stage and mood for the rest of the presentation. This piece is called Souvenir. When I first heard this piece, I was really kind of taken by its romantic style and its beautiful melody, and I really knew right away that students would really enjoy playing it. So just a quick overview, we're going to get more into it, but Génari Karganov was an Armenian composer, Russian-Armenian composer, during the Romantic era. And he may not have had the same fame that other composers had, but the work he produced is a wonderful addition to the repertoire of the greats of his time, like Tchaikovsky and Robert Schumann. One of his best contributions is to a new genre of music literature for children and amateur musicians. This new genre consisted of children's albums and were a new and innovative approach to teaching during the 19th century. The pieces are short, expressive, technical, and melodic, and are perfect as students prepare to progress to more advanced pieces like Brahms intermezzos and Chopin nocturnes. This is the only photo I was able to find of Karganov, since little is known about his life. So my lecture tonight will follow this order. We will first discuss the time period Karganov was living in, as well as the pedagogical practices of the time. In part 2, we will move on to the emergence of a new genre of piano literature called children's albums, brought to us by Robert Schumann and Peter Tchaikovsky, and how these influence our composer tonight. Next, we will move on to an in-depth look at the composer himself, and we will listen to and discuss how to teach selected pieces of his. So in our part 1 discussion tonight, let's set the stage for the time period Génari Karganov was living, and how the ideas of the time shaped composers. The Romantic period of music was during the approximate time of the late 18th century to the early 20th century. And it is thought by many that Beethoven was the turning point between the two eras of classical and romantic, and that his ideals on music, life, and culture shaped the ideas of many romantic composers. So the Romantic era was a time when music was inspired by nature, the fine arts, legends, and the supernatural. Romanticism involved expressing emotions and opposing the ideas of the Enlightenment period that came right before, where thoughts were more approached with a more scientific view. Composers at this time began freeing themselves of the conventional rules and ideals of the classical period, seeking to create music that was more individualistic, emotional, and programmatic. Romantic music also had longer drawn-out melodies. The use of rubato was frequently used to imitate the fluctuations of emotions. Rhythms were more varied, and composers used chromaticism, altered chords, and dissonance to create thick timbres. So composers like Chopin, pictured above here, incorporated traditional folk tunes into his music, which inspired a sense of nationalism. Romantic composers like Franz Schubert wanted to reflect themselves and their feelings through their works, and these works could also be autobiographical. And they really sought ways to evoke those same feelings in their listeners. This was also the birth of the virtuoso like Franz Liszt, whose impressive technical display and performances thrilled audiences. This period was also characterized by the Industrial Revolution, which allowed for new innovations in instruments capable of a larger range of dynamics, as well as the birth of the middle class. Because pianofortes could now be produced more quickly with machine technology, a larger population of people could afford to have their own pianos. Public concerts attended by this growing middle class allowed for composers to make money on their own by having public concerts by teaching, and this lessened their need to rely on a wealthy patron. Conservatories were founded to influence and foster creativity in musicians and prepare them to become citizen artists. Music was more widely available to people and shared among a wider audience. New forms of music emerged at this time, like nocturnes, arabesques, program music, and tone poems. Our composer tonight wrote many character pieces, which was also a new form of music, and which will be the main focus of his works tonight. Character pieces are defined as music that evokes a particular mood or moment. These pieces have titles that express the character of the piece. Many times, these pieces were grouped together in sets, and they emphasized expressive melody and harmony. Lastly, this era saw an increase in piano teachers, many among the most respected composers of the time, with new pedagogical material and instructions. It's important to know that the piano during this time was also changing significantly, and as the more modern style pianos gained prominence, the pedagogical methods focused on techniques for that instrument. Innovations in piano construction during the 19th century allowed for pianos to have a more powerful sound with longer sustained tones. This allowed composers to expand the range of tones and dynamics in their compositions. And by 1885, the modern piano was born, and pianos became a commonplace in middle-class families where members of the families entertained each other. So let's explore the changing of ideas and methodology in piano pedagogy during the 19th century. Piano pedagogy during the 18th century followed the ideals of the Enlightenment and were more based on technical skills and a recreation of music. This included approaching education with logical reasoning, progressive difficulty, and hours of study. Finger exercises include scales, arpeggios, etudes, and endless repetition. The most notable pedagogues of the time shown above were Carl Terne, Johann Hummel, and Charles Louis Hannon. They devised extensive repertoire which promoted perfectly uniform playing, few to no mistakes, and a focus on technical skills. Many of these teachers believed that to learn to play was by repeatedly recreating music in order to form a strong technical background. Carl Terne's book is titled 40 Daily Exercises for the Pianoforte with Prescribed Repetitions for Acquiring and Preserving Virtuosity, and that is quite a title. And his suggestion in that was that in addition to 1 hour of lessons daily, students should practice an hour of constant repetition of exercises. Hannon as well, in his La Pianiste Virtuoso, recommends a full hour of daily practices to his exercises. And we all know nobody likes to practice Hannon exercises. And also notice that both of these instructional books include the word virtuoso. So although there are few examples of music being composed specifically for children and their education, we can think of a few, like J.S. Bach's Notebook for Anna Magdalena, Notebook for Wilhelm Friedman Bach, and Leopold's Notebook for Mozart and Nano. These collections were mainly used within the family as a means to communicate, learn, and share ideas, and they were not widely published at the time. Education during the Romantic period saw a change in how children best learned. And one big influence in that change was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's publication Emile. His ideas were that children should be given the freedom to learn through sensory experiences, have materials that were child appropriate, and that appealed to a child's imagination and sense of play, and overall ensuring a child to grow up to be a morally responsible citizen. And this gained popularity, influencing schools and teachers to make changes in their approach to teaching and learning. If you've taught piano, or if you have ever learned piano, you probably have heard of the most famous and first ever children's album by Robert Schumann. Schumann and his wife Clara Schumann, a prominent pianist herself, were very unhappy with the pieces children usually studied, and so Robert took on the responsibility of creating something new and innovative. Although originally written for his own children, the albums, when published, were almost an instantaneous success and influenced many others to create their own similar albums. They were a treasure of pedagogical material and brought a more holistic approach to teaching. Robert's teacher and Clara's father, Frederick Wieck, pictured above, was a big influence in these compositions and the method behind this approach. Friedrich was one of the first teachers to apply Rousseau's theory of education to piano pedagogy. He believed that students should be allowed a sensory exploration of the piano and emphasize the individuality of each student. Wieck opposed the empty virtuosity of many performers of the day and believed that there were 3 cornerstones to teaching: the most sensitive listening, the finest taste, and a profound sensibility. Schumann greatly believed that musical excellence depended on a proper foundation, which was built from childhood, and he often lamented that he didn't have this opportunity in his youth, and thus he stressed that piano learning should be pleasurable for children, allowing them to find the beauty in the music. This approach helped students forget about how difficult or technical a piece was because they were really enjoying playing it. So Schumann's album for the young, Opus 68, was composed in 1848 and consists of 43 pieces. In a letter to his good friend and pianist, Karl Reineck, who will later teach Génari Karganov, he writes, "I cannot remember when I was ever in such a good musical mood as when I wrote these pieces. These pieces are taken right out of our family life. These albums contain more ideas, imagination, and imminent experiences for younger people." Pictured here is the title page, and it was prepared by Ludwig Richter, who was a famous illustrator of children's books. And as you can see, the pictures depict various aspects of children's lives. And Schumann was one of the first composers to add illustrations to his books. So Schumann's album for the young is divided into two parts, for the younger ones and for the more older ones. The pieces progress gradually in difficulty, and each piece is titled to reflect the characters or emotions of the piece, like The Wild Rider, The Little Morning Wanderer, and Soldier's March. Schumann's works were widely accepted at the time and inspired other composers to write their own versions of children's albums. One of the most well-known is Peter Tchaikovsky, and happy birthday, that's his birthday today, to Peter Tchaikovsky, who also found that literature was lacking in Russian children's repertoire. He writes a letter to his patron. "A while ago, I thought it would not be a bad idea to make a small contribution to the stock of children's musical literature, which is very modest. I want to create a series of little individual pieces just for children with an attractive title like Schumann." With the go-ahead from his publisher, he composed the album in 2 months and completed it in May of 1878. His album for the young, Opus 39, is a collection of 24 pieces, each with a descriptive title depicting the various aspects of children's lives, and is dedicated to his favorite nephew. Tchaikovsky is considered one of the first Russian composers to write music specifically for children's education. Like Schumann, this work was widely accepted and was praised for the perfect balancing of rhythm, fingering, and musical content. Songs like Morning Prayer, Old French Song, Playing Horse Games, Baby Yaga were all great sources for teaching concepts like staccato, arpeggios, dynamic control, and melodic shaping. This is the title page of the original edition, and as you can see, it's very similar to Schumann, with pictures of children and depicting various aspects of their lives. So part 3, let's talk about Génari Karganov. So there are several piano teachers and professionals I've spoken with recently about my topic tonight, and each one said the same thing when I mentioned Génari Karganov. They all asked, who is that? So I was first introduced to Karganov while preparing one of my intermediate students for the Level 8 Royal Conservatory exam. We needed to pick 2 etudes to learn from a long list of composers, and playing through them, both my student and I really liked a piece called Elfentanz, or Dance of the Elves. It was exciting, and my students liked playing it because it had a quick tempo, a nice little melody, and contrasting moods. It sounded mythical and evoked a scene of little elves dancing. This made me research some more on this composer I had never heard of before. Unfortunately, research on him is slim with little on his life and works, and this is in part due to him dying very young at the age of 31. We know about his general life and his education, and there are several references to him in the diary of Peter Tchaikovsky, who was a huge influence and an acquaintance of Karganov. So Génari Osipovich Karganov was an Armenian-Russian composer born in 1858 in Gorelky, Georgia. And Georgia is located on the eastern edge of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and is surrounded by Russia, Turkey, and Armenia. It's in Tiflis, the capital, that Karganov spends most of his life. Tiflis was annexed by the Russian Empire in the early 1800s, and Russia sought to make the city into a more modern European city, with better improved roads, rebuilding old structures, building new structures, and stimulating culture and economic growth. This was considered a cultural renaissance for the city. So he was the son of a military man, General Osip Ivanovich Karganov, and had 5 siblings. He grew up in a musical family with several of his brothers and sisters becoming prominent singers themselves. His family was wealthy enough to be allowed for the kids to be allowed to follow their passions. So let's talk a little bit about his education. So Eduard Epstein was Karganov's first teacher, and this may have been the start to Karganov's inspiration for teaching and composing for children, as well as his compositional style. Epstein attended the Leipzig Conservatory and later dedicated himself to pedagogical work. It's in Tiflis, the capital of Georgia, that he settled and became the first professional piano teacher there. Epstein also taught for the Imperial Russian Music Society, and he published several books on music education and even a guide for parents whose children were learning music. Karganov clearly got started with a certain approach to teaching, very much like Schumann did with his teacher, Friedrich Wieck. In 1874, Karganov attends the Leipzig School of Music and studies under Karl Reineck. Reineck was highly influenced in his teachings and creativity by Robert Schumann, who he was well acquainted with and admired greatly. So it can be deduced that Karganov was very aware of Schumann's albums, since we saw the above correspondence between the two. While at the Leipzig School of Music, Karganov also takes lessons from Ernest Ferdinand Wenzel, who also studied under Friedrich Wieck and was acquaintances of Robert Schumann. In 1877 or 1879, Karganov attends the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where he hones his piano skills under the guidance of Louis Brassin and Gustav Kross. Returning to Georgia, Génari Karganov moves to Tiflis and begins working as a civil servant, composing on the side. During his short life, Karganov became a prominent and well-respected musician in Tiflis and was known as a talented musician and performer. For a time, he was a teacher at the Imperial Russian Music Society, and he makes close acquaintances with Mikhail Ivanov, who was the first director of the Russian Music Society there for 7 years. He took Karganov under his wing in Tiflis. Karganov reveled in performing, even performing for Tchaikovsky himself. According to local historians, audiences were thrilled with his works and performances, and they loved his piano pieces, like Bayati Cycle and the Arabesques set and watercolor set. He was described as very happy, a little overweight, and with a great sense of humor and rapport. And he was responsible for writing the ongoings of the music scene in Tiflis and preserved their rich cultural history. Tchaikovsky visited Tiflis at least 5 times between 1886 and 1890. His brother Anatoly was the state prosecutor and later the governor of Tiflis. During his visits, he would often meet with Karganov, and there are several journal entries that mention him and their meetings. Génari Karganov died on his way back from St. Petersburg in 1890, where he had been invited to the anniversary of Anton Rubinstein. Because his life was cut short, we can never know how much more he could have contributed to the music world. Génari Karganov works consists mainly of solo piano pieces. This includes the 2 children's albums we will discuss tonight. He also wrote in many styles like arabesques, tarantellas, waltzes, etudes, and rhapsody. And this is a comprehensive list of his pieces that was in the back of one of his published books. So according to IMSLP, Génari Karganov has 25 published works. These are primarily solo piano pieces and range from beginner intermediate works to a more intermediate advanced level. So for someone who is not very well known, he did have a good amount of his works published. And here are a couple of his collections and their title pages. So Karganov's children's album, Opus 25, consists of 8 pieces, which progress gradually in difficulty. Published by D. Rotter in Leipzig, who was also Tchaikovsky's publisher, it can be inferred that perhaps Tchaikovsky may have collected the piano works of Karganov and had them published after his death in 1890. It's possible Karganov wrote this collection during the years of 1880 to 1890, after Tchaikovsky had published his own album. This title page here is artful with flowers and birds and a little bit similar to Schumann and Tchaikovsky's. So let's start and look at some pieces tonight. Tonight, Gorelky, translates to children playing, and it is a quick and energetic piece that may appeal to an intermediate student. This teaches students how to use staccato and accents to create the playful sounds that imitate the fast and quick movements of children playing. Let's first listen to the piece, and then we will discuss how to play staccato and ways to count in 6/8. And it's important to remind students that staccato means to separate the notes, so there's space in between each note, but not necessarily play super fast or short. And many students have the tendency to play staccato using their full arms and lifting their fingers too high like this. This is not feasible when playing at tempo. So there are 3 types of staccato: finger, wrist, and arm staccato. And for this piece, I would recommend students play with a combination wrist and finger staccato. Finger staccato requires a round hand shape, firmer fingertips, and keeping the keys close to the piano with a slight peck like at the motion at the piano. And this is going to be used for our broken chords and stepwise patterns, as we can see in our green color. So this is what it would be like. My hand is very close to the piano, and I don't hop up. Because of the accent, a little bit heavier on the first one, and light motion on the next. For the scale-like patterns, very close. So for the blocked chords, a wrist staccato will be used, and this requires also a round hand shape, firm fingertips, and a more relaxed, bouncy wrist. And this will make a big difference when students pick up the tempo. So for our blocked chords here in red, which are balanced between the right hand and left hand in this piece, but for the left hand, round hand shape, firm fingertips again so that there's no bend in the joints. And this enables to make sure that students press all the keys down at the same time. And there will be a slight bounce in the wrist. And this will keep the piece very light and not a heavy feeling. So although this piece is in 6/8, the tempo is quick, and counting to 6 each measure really isn't feasible. So because 6/8 is a compound meter, it can be counted different ways. And one exercise is to have students look at the score and find out how the group notes are grouped. Here we can see that throughout most of the piece, the notes are grouped in groups of 2 with 3/8 notes. And those are in our little boxes right here. And that should give a student a visual idea of how we really want to count, because we want to count in 2 actually. And also, because I think listening is a very extremely valuable part of learning, you can also ask them to clap while you play. At tempo, they will see how clapping or counting to 6 doesn't really work so well. It would be way too fast, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is a lot to do while they're playing. So at this point, ask them to clap instead only on beats 1 and 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When they can do that now, all they have to do is change the 4 to a 2. And now there are 1, 2, 1, 2. There are 2 measures, however, in this piece that are a little bit tricky, and students will have to change quickly their counting, as shown above over here in these boxes. This is a tricky area to count, and students can kind of get off tempo here, because their counting is now going to go to 3. So students can practice these kind of 5 measures in a loop almost, counting 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And I also have the students maybe tap it on the piano as well, and that works really well with coordination, or they can use a metronome. So on the piano, it would be, we have our beat. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And this should really help them to get through that little bit of a tricky passage. Our next piece is called Gebet, which translates to the prayer. It is in the key of E flat major. The time is 3/4. And the tempo is moderato cantabile, which means not too fast, moderate tempo with a singing quality. Tchaikovsky and Schumann had similar chorale-style pieces in their albums as well. So let's listen to it first, and then discuss playing what it means to play in chorale style and using legato pedaling. Important piece for understanding polyphonic playing. It helps students develop the skills to play in a chorale style, learning to realize the different voices and connecting the chords smoothly with the pedal. At first, this may seem like an easy piece, but students must first learn and understand its structure to play it correctly. Students may not have had this kind of chorale style piece before, and it's not enough for them just to sit and read and play as written. Students now will get the chance to learn to distinguish the 4 voices in chorale style music, and they are the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the bass. A suggested practice would be to have students play each individual voice or part before putting them together harmonically. So help students to identify these parts by highlighting them in different colors, which is shown up above here. And then ask them to play the different voices. So we'll play the top voice first. And now let's play the bass. And our middle voice. So this will really also help students to understand that they must hold certain notes. And a lot of students really completely ignore holding some of these notes because they don't understand why they need to. So next is picking out the important parts, which is the melody and the bass. So have students play the top voice and the bass. This will help them later on, especially when learning Bach pieces or any other chorale style piece. So now we're going to play the bass and the melody. Students should be able to get through it. So for this piece, I would suggest a legato pedaling to really smoothly connect the chords. This can also be called syncopated pedaling because the motion of the hands is opposite the motion of the pedal. This means also that the foot releases exactly when the hands go down on the keys and then quickly back down up with the pedal. Another way to describe this is that the hands and foot move towards each other each time the pedal is changed. And it's important for students to remember to keep their heel on the floor and with just the front part of their foot pressing down on the pedal. And this is a little bit of a tricky coordination for some students, so practicing this very slowly or playing just diatonic chords up and down the piano is a great exercise. So let's play this part here with our pedal. So as you can see, I marked where our foot goes down and comes back up. And this is what it would be. Down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, let's move on to the next piece. So the next piece is called En Bach, and it means on the river or by the brook. And fluid arm and wrist motion is really important in this piece to create the feeling of flowing water. Even the way the score is written, we can see the up-down motion of the notes, and students should imitate this motion with their arms and wrists, almost like creating waves of the water. To do this effectively, students will use a musical technique called legato to produce a fluid and continuous motion between the notes. Legato playing means to connect the notes so there is no space between them, but a continuous motion. The fingers aren't released until the next finger goes down on the key. In this case, the motion is shared between both hands. To do this, make sure your fingers don't fully lift until the next note is played, connecting the sounds, making sure there's no space between them. This also helps to make sure that students don't hold notes longer than their value. Arms and wrists must be loose and relaxed. So practicing this without the pedal is first recommended so students can get the idea of the motion and not rely on the pedal to make the smooth connection. And a light pedal can be added later on. So this is what it would be like slowly. We would play. Right away. Students can also practice this in their scales using two hands. This song is pieces in G major, so we can try it with the G major scale using both of our hands. And it will imitate the motion of this piece. Okay. Oh, also, and also, if we do add a light pedal afterwards, after a student's comfortable with this, I suggest that it goes on beat 2 and up on beat 3. So it would be like this. Down, up, down, up, blur the notes too much together then. They really want to rely on their arms to create the smoothness. So gradual changes in dynamics are also another way for the music to sound like water flowing. Just like our notes are going up and down, the dynamics also have motion. And students should understand that a crescendo, which is a gradual increase in the volume, using a gradual pressure and changes in the fingers. While diminuendo are a gradual decrease in volume as well as a decrease in pressure. Crescendo means to grow in Italian, and students can practice this with scales to get a sense of the changes in pressure as they get louder and softer. And again, because we're balancing the phrases with both hands, practicing scales with a similar motion of the piece will help students to feel the distribution of pressure in the piece and incorporate our dynamics. So here we have a G major scale again, and now we want to crescendo up and diminuendo down. So I also like to suggest recording students so they can hear for themselves their own dynamics. It's very sometimes difficult for them to hear it while they're playing. And they really think that they're doing something that maybe they aren't. So I always suggest recording them and asking them to analyze how they played. Was their crescendo gradual or was it abrupt? And did their volume get to what was expected? Here, of course, I should also suggest students play slowly until they have a good sense of control. The changes in this dynamic example right here occur over 12 measures from piano to forte back to piano. So once a student can hear and feel this gradual change, they will feel more in control for the rest of the piece. And these colors here indicate a gradual change going from piano, getting a little bit louder to mezzo piano, a little bit louder to mezzo forte, finally at forte, and then coming back down in order. And it will sound like this. Of how we want to play these passages, and there's a lot of this in here because, like I said, it wants to imitate the motion of water. All right, so our next piece is called Grossvater Tanz, and this is kind of a little bit of a bump up in difficulty. Grossvater Tanz means grandfather dance. And this is a cute minuet style piece that students can have fun imagining a silly grandfather dancing around. And Karganov really uses rhythm and the grace notes here to play with that idea. The main teaching points here are dotted note rhythms, 16th and 32nd notes, grace notes, and also the correct fingering and playing of thirds. So first, let's listen to it, or let's listen to the beginning part. Look at the grace notes. And grace notes are defined them for students as a brief note whose function is as an ornament or an embellishment. And the grace note here should glide quickly into the first note, which gets the primary stress. In this piece, there is even accent on that first note. And because of this accent, the grace notes are played a little bit before the first beat. And the grace notes, so that the F is played with the chord. And this is something that you can practice with your students, and with slight, close to the keyed fingers. And here we have, oh, there's my, students can practice. Or even slower at first. And once they get comfortable, a little bit faster. And the same thing with the next one. So you can see they happen a little tiny bit before. So also in this picture, or the score here, we have a couple of rhythms that can be a bit tricky. And we're going to break it down in the next slide in an exercise. So again, rhythm is a technique Karganov uses here to make this song sound spirited and comical. Dotted rhythms, 16th notes and 32nd notes are a little bit sometimes scary for students, and maybe they haven't encountered them before. Breaking down the rhythm outside of reading the notes helps students later also identify similar rhythms. Many students may not feel like saying the rhythm is important, but I always say if you can say it, you can play it. So here we will use ta and tt. So our ta is going to be our 8th note, our tt will be our 16th note, and for our dotted 8th note will be a ta. So understanding this will help them later on, and is really easy to use. This approach also helps students identify rhythms a little bit faster and a little bit easier than counting in a traditional 1E and a 2E and a. So it will go like this. And the next one is ta, ta, ta. 1, 2, sorry. And once they get comfortable saying this, they can now apply it to the piece. Maybe in the beginning, just with the top notes. And that will help them to really understand, because the rest of the piece is pretty standard. There's not very much going on in terms of rhythm like this. So this is a continuous rhythm that happens. A technical problem to address with this is also playing in thirds, and this is especially difficult for some students since they tend to bounce their hands to compensate for the awkward feeling of their fingers. But in order to play legato, the fingers must be connected, and students will need to practice consistently with the correct fingerings. Playing legato thirds requires changing fingers while the keys are still down. So here are a suggested finger numbers, and this is something that you can work with your student if they're not already written in. And this will really help them later on if they encounter this, and they will know what fingers they can use and write them in. So another way to help with thirds is take away the rhythm in the beginning. And we're going to play just the thirds, but the top note is going to be legato, and the bottom note will be staccato, and it will kind of be like this. And that way they're keeping the top of their top note legato, and this will help eventually when they get a little bit faster. So our next piece is called Kleiner Walzer, which means little waltz, and students will get the chance to use rubato to create the dance-like character of this piece. This piece also has a left-hand melody in the relative minor. First, let's listen to it. So rubato is a little bit of a difficult idea for many younger students because it's a more abstract idea, and developmentally children don't understand abstract ideas until about the age of 12. However, rubato can be taught by using their ears, a metaphor, and also following by example. And rubato is defined as the speeding up or slowing down of the music without ever gaining or losing time. It adds motion and character to a piece. And many times we use it like this right here at the end of a phrase. Sometimes I like to think of it as a wind-up toy that starts slowly losing motion until it's wound up again. Or like a train or roller coaster going up hills where it goes up slower and then comes back down and goes up slower and come down. And that's the kind of motion or feeling that we want to have. So one way, of course, is to show the students what it sounds like without rubato. So let's just play a little bit of it without rubato and very straight rhythm. Different quality to this piece. It doesn't really sound as much of a waltz. So now let's play it again, but let's add some rubato and ask the students to identify where they hear the slowing down or speeding up. Section B of this waltz, we take a turn into the relative key from B flat major to G minor. And here's a good spot for teaching some basic theory and understanding how the tonality of a piece can change and also change its character. The left hand takes the melody also, and it's important that students have a good balance between the two hands, making sure not to make the right hand too loud or overpowering. Practicing the left hand alone at here first is suggested so they can really hear the melody and make sure that they are holding all notes to their full value. So here's our left hand. And once they really understand that, then we can add both hands to it, making sure that their right hand has a good balance and not too loud. Okay, so let's briefly look at Karganov's second children's album, Opus 21. These pieces are definitely a step up in difficulty and have more traditional titles describing the form of the piece. And these are in 2 volumes and a variety of styles like tarantellas, polkas, mazurkas, and scherzos. These again are a little bit for more advanced students. The pieces are a little bit longer and a little bit more technical, but they're not that long, about 2 pages, 3 pages, and are really perfect for preparing intermediate students for more advanced and longer works. So let's really quickly look at Dance of the Elves. Okay, so this piece teaches students how to play legato in one hand and staccato in the other. And this really evokes the slight movements of dancing elves. Students will also learn how to play leggermente and also learn how to change characters in the middle section where there is a key change and tempo change. So students will learn to play leggermente, which means a rapid passage played with as little pressure as possible. And this is really, again, to imitate the sound of little elves dancing. Students must also play the right hand legato and the left hand staccato. So let's just quickly listen to the opening section. very small movements on the piano, as quiet as I can, but making sure I make a sound still. In the next section, we have key change, and here students can really get the chance to work a little bit on their key signatures and the relationships between them. This piece starts in E minor, but here it goes to the parallel major, and eventually then back to E minor. And this really changes the character of the piece significantly. So let's just hear a little tiny bit. It's really a nice, fun piece to play. So that will be all today, and I really hope that you really enjoyed listening to these pieces, learning about maybe a composer you have never heard of before. And remember that all these pieces are open source, so you can find them on IMSLP, and there's a lot of pieces and a lot of variety to choose from. So hopefully you might go find one that you like, maybe teach a student one, and you can really, I hopefully enjoy it. So I want to thank you for coming tonight, and I hope that you had a good night, and thank you very much.